Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome, everybody. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Zaya Benazzo.
We are here in the unceded territory of the coastal Miwok people in South Pomo, so-called colonial name Sebastopol, California.
And
Welcome.
actually, when we visited the occupied West Bank 2 years ago for the film, and we got back to California, we were like, wow, we are settlers. But we had to go there to realize the history here. That was our journey.
Yeah.
Like, well, we're really settlers.
Yeah, I remember driving on the road and seeing like being in the West Bank with this road for this. I was like completely blew my mind. It's completely changed everything.
So today is day 2 of the film premiere Where Olive Trees Weep. Yesterday we had our first conversation with the main character Ashira Darwish, and if you missed the conversation, it's still available on YouTube, so you can watch it later today.
Yeah, and today the conversation, the panel, the title is Dehumanization and the Ongoing Nakba in Palestine. We have 3 guests. I'm going to briefly read a short bio of each and every one of them before we enter the conversation. So, Sherene Seikaly, PhD Associate Professor of History at UC Santa Barbara, PhD in History and Middle Eastern and Islamic Study from NYU, and a Master from Georgetown University. A former director of Middle East Studies Center at American University in Cairo, held fellowship at Georgetown and Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. Thank you, Sherene. I hope I didn't destroy all the names. Appreciate it. Thank you. Then we have Ussama Makdisi, PhD Professor of History and Chancellor's Chair at UC Berkeley. Carnegie Scholar in 2009 for work on Muslim societies, author of award-winning books, including The Age of Coexistence in 2019, and Artillery of Heaven in 2008. Expert in Middle Eastern history and US-Arab relations. Thank you, Sama. Thank you. And last but not least, we have Nathan Thrall, Jerusalem-based American author and journalist. His book, A Day in the Life of Abed Salama, won the 2024 Pulitzer for nonfiction. Contributed to the New York Times Magazine, London Review of Books, and New York Review of Books. He's a former director at the International Crisis Group and a professor at Bard College. Welcome, Nathan. Thank you. Thank you.
And you're in Berlin now, Nathan, right? Not in Jerusalem.
No, I'm in Jerusalem.
Oh, you are? Okay,
Yeah.
wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone, and what a pleasure to have the 3 of you in conversation. We've prepared some questions, but we can also just flow with what feels alive in the conversation. And we will leave questions to hear also from the audience at the end for the last 30 minutes. To share your question, please type it in the Q&A box and raise your hand. Ideally, you will have your video on and we can bring you on camera, or we can read your question. You can indicate which one you prefer. And please keep the questions very succinct. It will come, yeah, exactly. Somebody already practiced. Great. So, Ussama, maybe we'll start with you first, since you have the deep history look on where we are today. In your book, Age of Coexistence, you explore the historical context of interfaith and intercommunal relationships in the Middle East. How European colonialism and the emergence of colonial Zionism has disrupted the age of coexistence without idealizing the age of coexistence too, and has led to the occupation, to the apartheid, the ongoing Nakba, and to the genocide in Gaza today. If you, yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me. It's good to see my fellow panelists. Thank you also for the film that you made, and thank you, of course, for the question. And basically, the answer is very simple. There is, of course, in the Middle East, an extraordinarily long and rich history of coexistence, as you said, that shouldn't be romanticized, but should be underscored and appreciated for the depth and the interactions over centuries in very different ways between Muslims, Christians, Jews, among Muslims, among Christians, among Jews, all sorts of peoples who've lived together in various conditions. And there's a depth of intimacy that we barely even know about and acknowledge. We've barely studied. We have the broad outline, but we don't have a very strong sense. And what's interesting is that by the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, in the Arab part of the Ottoman Empire, there was, in fact, an extraordinary coming together of Muslim and non-Muslim. The very sense of being Arab in a modern sense developed in the late 19th century in Palestine, in Lebanon, or in places that would become Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, all these places, Iraq, an extraordinary ability and willingness and desire on the part of people to actually take their own destiny in their own hands and shape a future together. And so that's where you have the sense of being really honestly a Christian Arab in a modern sense, a Muslim Arab in a modern sense. And were it not for colonial Zionism, there would have also been a Jewish Arab belonging and being. And what's interesting is how then Zionism, which emerged not in the Middle East, not among the Jewish communities of the Middle East, not among any of the indigenous communities of the Middle East, including the Jewish communities, but in Europe, answering European questions. Zionism proposed a completely different model of politics, which is an exclusive ethno-religious nationalist project, which came into Palestine, insisted on recreating a multi-religious space and destroying a multi-religious space and recreating it as an exclusionary Jewish nationalist project through the help of British colonialism. And then the rest is history, in a sense. So it's really that sense of a contrast between a profound history of coexistence and a multi-religious area and a European project that was conceived to answer European anti-Semitism, European romanticism, European nationalism, and then borrowed European colonial techniques and ideologies to actually remake Palestine. And the result was the Nakba and where we are today.
And the borders were redrawn first by European colonialists, right? Before they arrived to the region.
For sure, yeah, the borders were remade. I mean, all the modern Middle East, the modern Arab world as we know it today, the modern Middle East was remade by European powers after World War I, especially the Arab East. So all the modern states, the mandates that were called so-called mandates, European colonies, basically. So the Europeans had to figure out, how do we colonize this part of the world? And at the same time, pay lip service to the idea of self-determination, which was a new idea that came out after World War I. And so the way they came up with this is to create this fiction of mandates, this idea of European allegedly civilized tutors to help natives achieve independence. And that was the fiction, the late colonialism, the fiction of how Syria, Lebanon, eventually Jordan and Iraq were created as states. And the interesting thing is that they drew these borders and maps and states. They dominated these areas with the idea that each of these places would eventually lead to independence, except for Palestine. I mean, Sherene knows this, and Nathan, I'm sure, knows this, and your listeners and viewers should know this, except Palestine. It's the one mandate, the one area, the one colony where the natives were completely ignored as a political people. And and so the Europeans came in and said, no, in Palestine alone, unlike Syria, unlike Lebanon, unlike Jordan, unlike Egypt, unlike Iraq, in Palestine alone, the Zionist movement will be privileged and a Jewish national home will be established, irrespective of the wishes of the vast majority of the indigenous population. It's kind of a scandal when you actually read the history, know the history.
Yeah. And Sherene, you have done a lot of research on the more recent history and how the suppression of the Palestinian narratives and Palestinian history and experiences has led to the dehumanization of Palestinian people. From your work, like, how do you see that connection of suppression of history and narratives leading to dehumanization?
Thank you.
Oh, hold on. You were muted again. Hold on 1 second.
No.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Actually, like Ussama, I do work in the late 19th century and up until the 20th. So I'm not that much more contemporary than that. I'm also a historian, and my book, Men of Capital, Scarcity and Economy and Mandate Palestine, was a book that was about the period between 1917 and 1948, when the very period that Ussama was describing as the initiation of the politics of deferral that we see that Palestinians are living under until today. What I mean by that politics of deferral is to draw on what Ussama was suggesting, which is the ways that in the mandate structure, itself a structure that was based on a civilizational logic that was racialized. It's important to note here that the Eastern Mediterranean, the Arab provinces of the former Ottoman Empire that had then at that point been dismantled, along with the German territories, the German and Austrian territories in Asia and Africa, all came under a mandate structure. And those mandate structures were themselves racialized categories categorized as either A, B, or C. The Eastern Mediterranean and the Arab provinces were deemed Area A, that is, they were deemed that they were available to eventual self-rule, right? And so just as Ussama said, this mandate structure, which was put together by the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, was based on a civilizational hierarchy. The exception in Palestine was that civilizational hierarchy was further erased because of the ways that British mandate rule was committed from the outset to the Zionist project of creating a Jewish state on a piece of land where the majority of the people were not Jewish. In the Permanent Mandates Commission, which was the overseer of this mandate structure, Palestine was the sole space in which the Permanent Mandates Commission signed on to settler colonial dispossession. As for your second point about dehumanization, I'd like to really also insist that we step out of this formula. I think the formula in which we as Palestinians are evidencing our humanity is long. It is a long time to reject this formula. I don't want to use the language of humanization and dehumanization. I will continue to insist on our humanity. What Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are doing now, how they are making life despite death, you can see in these makeshift tents that are coming up, right? And we've seen these makeshift tents of schools since 1948, where education is understood as if not the key to our liberation and return. And so in that sense, I think one of the lessons that we've learned, and as historians, we know that every single Israeli assault on Palestine and the Palestinians has targeted archives, has targeted Palestinian archives, has held them captive, has held those archives themselves captive. And in that sense, we understand that settler colonialism is most threatened by our existence, is most threatened by our capacity to narrate our past, to understand our present, and to imagine a future. And I think what settler colonial regimes from Palestine to Turtle Island don't understand is that however hard you try to destroy those archives, we are the archive. We actually embody the archive, and our capacity to tell stories is not going to be extinguished by this genocide. And this is in particular why you see journalists being targeted. We have to think of all of the thousands of people that have been targeted: university professors, poets, writers, creatives, journalists, all the people who are there to bear witness and tell the story, because it is the story itself that is the biggest source of threat.
Wow.
Absolutely, yeah. And if there is humanity, the Gazans can teach us humanity, what humanity is. That's what I have seen every time I tune in to those videos coming through Gaza. This is humanity. We have forgotten what it is actually to feel and to be a human being and to be connected and to be ready to give your life for somebody else.
Yeah, and I want to just lift up my colleague Samira Smith, who's also Selma's colleague, and she's taught us in her work, and especially in her book Juridical Humanity, that it's that very formula, that if we accept that formula of human, non-human, dehumanized, the colonial project cannot give us our humanity, and it cannot take it away either. So
Wow.
This is a plea to really try to move beyond that formula.
Beautiful. Thank you. Beautiful.
Before we move to Nathan, I'm just curious, like Ussama, where did this story about Arabs being associated with violence, and like, how did this story begin? How did this racist view of this part of the world started? Like, historically, do you have any? I'm sure you have.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a quite old story and a narrative that goes back to Islamophobia, that goes back to a representation of Islam, that goes back to the idea of what Islam is in European Christian culture. But then, of course, it took on a very sort of an even more malign, I would say, salience in the 19th and 20th centuries, when the idea that people in the Middle East are inherently sectarian, that they're inherently violent, that they live only by their religious difference, and so on and so forth. And the most extraordinary myth racist myth came over and helped to justify, as Sherene is saying, the Zionist project in Palestine, which is to say that in our part of the world, despite in the Middle East, in other words, despite the enormous history of coexistence and religious difference and pluralism, religious, ethnic, and so on and so forth, without minimizing the tensions and the contradictions. We're historians in the end, but this extraordinary history of coexistence, somehow people in the Middle East were defined monolithically by their religious identities, so that people are thought of only as Sunni or Shia or Arab or Jewish. Do you see what I'm saying? And this idea somehow that Europeans and Americans, as in the United States, the idea of people who had slavery, who had colonialism, who had racism, who had anti-Semitism, who killed Protestants and killed Catholics and killed Jews and did all these things, horrific things to indigenous populations, somehow they were able to be pluralist, but our part of the world was considered to be inherently and perpetually sectarian. And that's the myth that then allows Europeans to come in after World War I and divide up our part of the world, the Middle East, and specifically then justify and legitimate Zionism in Palestine. So it's a very old myth, but it took on, and it was weaponized in a very destructive way after World War I in the Arab East.
The myth of the civilized Western, that's the one.
Yeah.
The myth that in the West there's religious pluralism and in the Middle East there's only sectarianism is really what it is. It's that myth that goes on. We've seen it everywhere.
Yeah.
And in the other indigenous part of the world, we brought our religion, Christianity, right? And we taught Christianity, the indigenous people, because their belief and spirituality was not civilized.
Yeah.
That's what we've seen traveling, filming our next movie all over the world, that
And the idea that Christianity is Western is like one of the great myths as well.
Right.
The Christianity and Islam and Judaism come from the Middle East, and you'll be surprised how many people don't understand this very basic idea that Palestinians, many of them are Christian, many people in the Middle East are Christian, many people in the Middle East are Jewish, many people are Muslim, many people are secular, and there's a whole range of diversity that we just never, that we tend to forget about.
Yeah, conveniently.
Yeah.
So Nathan, your book, Pulitzer Prize-winning book, "The Day in the Life of Abed Salama," it provides a powerful portrait of the impact on the daily life of the Israeli occupation and the apartheid system on the Palestinian life. How do you see your work contributing to the liberation, to the new world we want to see? How do you see it in the perspective of
And why did you choose to write a story that's seemingly an ordinary story,
Right.
to reveal the reality of occupation in the West Bank and Jerusalem?
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I'm a longtime reader and admirer of my co-panelists, and I love the film. I thought it was very well done and very moving. You know, the way that I see narrative nonfiction in this place is really about reaching a broad audience. I spent a lot of my career writing reports for an international NGO called the International Crisis Group. And they would write very detailed on-the-ground reports about what was happening here and in other areas all over the world. And I was enormously frustrated by the conversations that I had in the writing of those reports and then in discussing them with policymakers and other elites that were involved in Israel-Palestine, because the issue for them was not really a lack of understanding. Many of them did understand what was going on. They did understand that there is a system of ethnic domination here, that it meets the definition of apartheid in international law, and the issue, and that they are complicit in it. The senior U.S. policymakers who would say to me, behind the scenes, of course, we are supporting something that is totally immoral, and we are helping to perpetuate this system. So I had enough of those conversations that I really came to the conclusion that I was wasting my time writing reports for those people. And what I really needed to do was to try and reach a broader audience, because only if these policymakers felt that there was a different public climate that would accept them taking a different attitude, enacting different policies toward Israel-Palestine, could they even begin to imagine doing something like that. And some of them would frankly say to me, you know, the kinds of steps that I could take in the direction that you would like are tiny, and you would laugh at them. You would mock me for the kind of thing that I might propose realistically in my job. And I could lose my job over it. I could actually sacrifice my career. So for all of these reasons, you know, I came very late to a conclusion I probably should have come to without even starting this work. This is a pretty obvious point, I think, but it took me a while to reach the conclusion that really what we needed was a change in public consciousness. And so that's how I view the work of this book, is really to try and change the environment in which policymakers are acting. And I forgot there was a second part of your question, and I can't. Oh, why did I choose to tell about an accident? You know, I think that part of the aim of my book is to describe something that's systematic, and if one focuses on some horrific event, it's very easy to exceptionalize it and say that this was some horrible event but it's not the everyday reality. I was just watching actually a documentary that's going to come out. Someone I know is working on it about the Kafr Qasim massacre in 1956, when at the start of the 1956 war, Israel very deliberately imposed a curfew on a town of Palestinian citizens of Israel. These people were always living under a curfew, but they lowered the time of the curfew. I forgot what it was. Normally, they lowered it to 5 p.m. And they made this announcement after all of the workers had gone off to work outside of the village. So anybody who was returning, as they normally would after 5 p.m., was in violation of the curfew, and the order was to shoot and kill them. And 47 people were killed in cold blood in this massacre. And it's a huge and very important event. And it was part of a larger plan, actually. Israel thought that there might be a war with Jordan in 1956 when they started the war with the UK and France against Egypt. They thought that there would be a Jordanian front as well, and this was part of a plan to push Palestinian citizens out. As you know, this title of this presentation is Ongoing Nakba. This was, in the eyes of the soldiers who were executing it, it was to be a second Nakba. They were going to massacre these villagers and villagers elsewhere, and then everybody would be told to leave, and they would go toward Jordan. And as I was watching this documentary, and I've long been really interested in the Kafr Qasim massacre, I thought to myself, you know, it's so important, but I think that somebody who doesn't know a lot about Israel-Palestine could hear this story and say to themselves, yes, this is an exception. This is this massacre that happened, and it's only really through the testimony of the soldiers who were investigated afterward where they said, you know, I was behaving normally, and this is what my normal routine was, and actually the Palestinian citizens we regarded as enemies, and we weren't there to protect them. And you know, they were asked in their interrogations, would you, you know, kill a child who was a Palestinian citizen? And they said, yes, of course. And I found those kinds of testimonies just about their normal behavior much more damning and persuasive than actually the details of the massacre, which could be written off as some terrible commander who went rogue or what have you. And so with that was also a kind of similar thinking behind my choosing to tell the story of something commonplace like a bus accident. I didn't want to focus on, you know, a war in Gaza or, you know, some major event in the Second Intifada or something like the Kafr Qasim massacre. I wanted to just choose something that happens all over the world, but show what it actually looks like for a tragic bus accident to take place in this specific place with a bus full of kindergartners who are Palestinian on a road in Area C that's under full Israeli control, security control and administrative control, where Israeli police give out traffic tickets, and to show what it is for these parents to try and reach their children, some of them told that they're at hospitals in Jerusalem that the parents themselves cannot reach because of the color of their IDs. And through their navigation of this system, I felt that it was a way to explain a very elaborate bureaucracy of control that can be quite dry and boring when you read about all of the rules and all of the details. But when you actually are in the shoes of a person who has to get through the system, and they have to get through it on the worst day of their life, trying to find their child, I found that that was actually a way to really convey the whole architecture of segregation and domination.